Chapter 2 The Feast. I awoke with a start and was relieved to find myself snug in my own chamber at Kilcash, and not in some dark realm of the other world where I had dwelt in my dreams. The sunlight beamed in through the rippled yellow glass of my narrow chamber window, casting a golden light across the room, illuminating even the darkest recesses. I looked around at the damage from last night. My sheets were soaked in sweat and in disarray, my quilt cast off at the foot of the bed. On my desk, my writing papers were strewn across it. I had spilled a bottle of ink somehow, and it was dripping onto the flagstone floor. My clothes were scattered around the chamber, and my greyhound Bonin was curled up asleep on the green woolen dress I had worn the day before. A knock came on the heavy timber door of my chamber. "Isha, you must awake." It was my stepmother, the Lady Eleanor, and her voice was insistent. I often slept late when fear of my visions had kept me from sleep. Just one night of a dreamless sleep was what I longed for more than anything. "Isha, open this door at once," came Lady Eleanor's voice again with a loud knocking. I roused myself, pulled on a robe over my shift, and drew back the heavy latch on my door. Bonin looked up at the door as the door opened, but nuzzled back into the dress she was lying on and went back to sleep. Lady Eleanor stood there, resplendent in all her best finery in the English style. Her dark brown hair was perfectly smooth and tucked neatly under an ornate, pointed hood of golden edging and purple silk. She wore a large white ruff which gave her a regal and imposing air, and a resplendent gold cross upon her neck, with 3 tear-shaped pearls hanging from it. She was fit to attend the court of the king rather than a princedom in the southern province of Ireland. "Your father and brothers have returned victorious in battle," she announced. "They have been home since dawn." My elder brothers, Dermot, Donogh, and Fingon, had ridden out to battle with my father, while Owen, to his disappointment, had been appointed to stay behind. I ought to have been waiting in the castle courtyard to greet them upon their return. "It is almost midday," she added with a disapproving tone. "There is to be a feast tonight." She paused, looking into my messy chamber, and shook her head. "Ready yourself, girls," she said with a stern look on my dishevelled state, drenched in sweat from the visions of the night before, and my red gold hair hopelessly tousled from a night of tossing and turning in my bed. Lady Eleanor turned on her heel and went down the spiral staircase, her green silk skirts sweeping after her. A flurry of serving girls came into my chamber, carrying a wooden tub and steaming buckets of water. I thanked them all by name, and they left quietly. They hadn't looked me in the eye. Had there been more talk in the castle kitchens, I wondered. Perhaps they had heard of my screaming in the night. I sighed and shrugged my shoulders. There was bound to be gossip. I sprinkled some dried lavender from my own supply, made from the castle herb garden, into the steaming waters in the tub. Removing my sweat-sodden lena, I stepped in and immersed myself in the fragrant water, allowing the heaviness of my visions to ebb away. I combed out my unruly hair, cursing at the matted knots, until it fell in softly curling waves to my elbow. Reluctantly, I rose and quickly donned fresh linens. Catching sight of my looking-glass, I could see how the sunlight caught some shimmering pure gold strands in my otherwise red-hued hair. I was the only McCarthy Revoch with that colouring. The rest of my half-siblings were dark, with the exception of the fair-haired Fingon. They were all the sons of Lady Eleanor, while my mother, Aiton, had disappeared from Kilcash when I was but 5 years old. Vanished, presumed dead or worse, fled from Kilcash of her own accord. I preferred to think she had met with some terrible accident than that she had left my father and I behind. And worst of all, never loved us. They said she had been very beautiful, with azure eyes like my own, and marble white skin with hair of burnt orange like the sun. Beneath my pillow I kept a leather pouch, which contained a lock of her flame-red hair, braided with strands of my own red gold. I took another glance in the looking-glass, and hoped tonight at least I looked a little like her. I donned my best gown of silver grey silk, with intricately embroidered damask edging of swirling blue and purple floral patterns about the neckline and cuff. It was a flowing gown in the Gaelic style, without the voluminous skirts my stepmother preferred. I hoped it was still pleasing enough. Last of all, I donned a silver pendant with the McCarthy coat of arms, a stag standing rampant. It was a treasured gift from my father. Before leaving, I opened the window to air my chamber and paused to take in the view of the fields of golden barley rippling out from below the outer castle walls and sweeping down to the sea and the distant towers of the Abbey of Timalloga. I should rather be at the Abbey, helping in the infirmary or at my studies in the chapter house, than at a feast. A knock came at my door. "Isha!" It was Owen's voice. I hurried across my chamber and drew back the latch. Owen stood in the doorway, his hand outstretched to me. His wavy brown hair and short-clipped beard were neatly combed. He wore a black velvet beret, a serge green velvet doublet, and white silk hose. He looked like a gallant of the Tudor court. I grasped his hand. "Owen, you look well," I exclaimed. "As do you, sister," he replied with a smile. "Come, father has been asking for you," he said as we began to tread carefully down the spiral staircase to the great hall. I drew a sharp intake of breath as we entered the commotion of the packed great hall of Kilcash. It was a sharp contrast to the quietness of my chamber, and the noise and bustle were a shock. Soldiers were drinking and toasting their victory in battle. The piper played a merry reel. There were many richly dressed guests of neighbouring clans I recognised, as well as many strange faces I did not. A huge fire was roaring in the great hearth, below the triumphant McCarthy Reevach banner, a red stag rampant on a pure white pennant. The tables were filled with a huge array of meats, game, exotic fruits, and sweetmeats. An army of servants kept the ale, wine, and mead full in every cup. Upon the dais sat the Lady Eleanor and my elder brothers, Dermot, Donogh, and Fingon. The men had brought their favourite hounds in, and they tossed scraps to them under the tables. I spied my own greyhound, Bonan, seated by a burly old fighter called Finian, who winked to me as he passed some meat from his own plate to Bonan. I nodded back to him, smiling gratefully. Just then, a hush descended as my father entered the hall, accompanied by the clan Filla, a bard, a harper, and the principal chieftains of the province of South Munster. They all seated themselves in places of honour at the tables. Owen gave me his arm and guided me swiftly to our seats upon the dais. I held my breath as more than a few heads turned to observe us as we passed. My father alone remained standing as silence descended upon the hall. My father, Donald McCarthy Reevach, Prince of Cairbre, was a great warrior and a great chieftain of the clan. Even at the age of 60 years, his tall, strong frame overshadowed most of the men, and his ash-brown hair and beard had only begun to grey. He was richly dressed for the feast. The thread of gold glistened upon his doublet in the glow of the fire. As he turned to survey the faces of his guests before speaking, he pushed back his flowing fur-lined mantle and addressed the hall. "Honoured guests, loyal warriors and clansmen, welcome. Tonight we have returned once again victorious from repelling a raid upon the borders of the princedom of Cairbre by our enemy James Fitzgerald, Earl of Desmond. Yet we must not rest idle or be complacent. The Earl is strong, eager for dominance, and his raids are becoming more frequent and more savage. The Earl would see himself as a sovereign king of all Ireland if he could. There is also Dermod Ó Fitzgerald, the Earl of Kildare, and the King's Lord Deputy, who, though my kinsman through marriage and oft-times our ally, is wont to side with his Fitzgerald kinsman, the Earl of Desmond. I urge you once more, we the clans of South Munster must remain united. If we fall to fighting amongst ourselves, we shall be open to attack by James Fitzgerald, who seeks to take back the lands our grandfathers have won back from him over the last 2 centuries. We seek to strengthen our alliance with our honoured guests, the Ó Sullivan Beare and the McCarthy Moor, the King of Jasmoon, against our enemy James Fitzgerald, Earl of Desmond. We must put aside petty feuds and quarrels amongst ourselves and keep Cairbre whole and united against Desmond. He raised his goblet and gave what was meant to be a toast, but to the warrior's approval came out as the war cry, "Cairbre aboo!" The clan soldiers stood up and joined in cheering raucously, "Cairbre aboo! Cairbre aboo! Cairbre aboo!" My father raised his hands to quell the cheers, saying, "I bid you be seated now. Welcome to my hall. Enjoy the food, wine, and mead at my table, and all the hospitality my hearth and home have to offer. Let us have music and song," he said, signalling to the harper. The harper began to play, and the buzz of voices and raucous laughter soon resumed in the great hall. At the table just below the dais sat a tall, dark-haired young chieftain, who wore a great shaggy fur mantle about his broad shoulders. I could not see his face, but I noticed his tousled raven-black hair mingling with the rich fur of his mantle. "Dermod," Owen called to him, beckoning him over. He rose and strode toward us, and I blushed as his gaze turned upon me. His eyes were a piercing ice-grey blue. I cast my own eyes down, feeling incredibly shy with his upon mine. He was very fair of complexion, contrasted with a soft raven-black beard. His prowess as a fighter was hinted at by his athletic physique and the enormous longsword he wore slung across his back. Owen turned to introduce him. "Isha, this is Dermod Ó Sullivan Beare, Prince of Beare." Dermod smiled at me, inclined his head courteously. "It is good to meet with you, Isha. Your brothers have often spoken of you. Would you do me the honour of a dance?" "Of course," I answered with a smile. How could I refuse so gracious an offer? Yet I took his outstretched hand with some nervousness. All eyes fell upon us as we took our places as the first couple in the dance. The harper began to play a slow French courtly dance, and Dermod led me gracefully through it, his movements timed perfectly to each phrase of the music, his touch gentle and attentive. His grey-blue eyes were fixed upon mine, but his broad smile was disarming, and I could not look away. When the dance ended, I led him over to the soldiers' table where my greyhound Bonan sat at the feet of the old soldier Finian. "Thanks, Finian," I said, and bent down to stroke the muzzle of the sleeping hound, who sat with her slender body curled gracefully as an Egyptian sphinx, her dainty narrow snout resting on her paws. "This is Bonan," I said to Dermod. "She is a great hunter. I chose her for her beautiful coat, but she has become one of our fastest hounds." Dermod bent down and stroked her gently. "She is an unusual colour. I have never seen this golden russet colour in a greyhound before," he said, smiling. "She reminds me of her owner." I laughed, delighted at this observation. "That is not why I chose her, I promise you. And Dermod, did you bring a hound with you?" "His name is Brandov. Would you like to see him? He is in the stable," he said, offering me his arm. I took it readily. "I should like nothing better," I said with a smile. I did not hesitate, for besides my desire for the cool night air, it was one of my favourite places in the castle. My horse Rua, my beautiful chestnut mare, was stabled there, and I was far more at home there than in the great hall. As we stepped out into the courtyard, I saw Owen nodding to a servant girl to follow after us. I sighed. I knew I could not be unattended, but I had an awful dislike of being watched and spied upon. Dermod led me across the dark courtyard, lit only by a few flickering torches, to where his hound was chained up in a shadowy corner of the stable. I could just make out the massive form of the great wolfhound through the gloom, standing to greet his master. Here is Brandove. He is a great big fellow, is he not? Dermot said, bending to tussle the long shaggy fur about the hound's head fondly. I have never seen a wolfhound so big, I answered, nervous of the enormous hound, who stood almost as high as my chest. He will not bite, not when you are with me at least, Dermot assured me, holding out his hand to draw me closer. She's a friend, eh, Brandove? And he guided my hand gently to the glossy fur on the hound's neck. Oh, but his fur is soft, I exclaimed in surprise. Not coarse like my father's hounds. His is silken. Yes, he was bred from a French mountain dog. He is not pure wolfhound, Dermot explained. Suddenly the great hound barked deep and low, and I startled. I tripped in the darkness and fell into the arms of Dermot, knocking us both against the stable wall. My face was so close to his I could smell the sweetness of his breath, and I froze there stunned a little. His hands moved to my back to steady me, and then lingered, holding me gently in place. Forgive me, I whispered as his eyes met mine full of gentleness. A sweet trespass, he said softly, his breath sweet and warm upon me, his lips drawing slowly nearer. But something did not feel quite right. I remembered the pair of amber eyes in my vision, and how they had sought me out from amidst the crowd. I felt a tightness in my chest at the thought of it. I was bound to the tawny-haired man somehow, I felt it. And so I resisted. I drew my face away and took a few steps back. I rearranged my skirt self-consciously, blushing profusely. I could no longer look at Dermot. I think perhaps I should retire, I said, in what I hoped was as firm a tone as I could muster. Just a moment longer. It is a clear night. Let us walk on the battlements, he asked. I hesitated as he held out his hand, saying, I promise you I will behave. You took me a little by surprise just now. I am not usually so bold. I smiled at him, lifting my eyes to meet his gaze, but sadly shook my head. It was like being at a crossroads. If I took his hand now, perhaps I could have a different future, one that didn't lead to the scaffold at Tyburn and the agony of being parted forever from a tawny-haired man with amber eyes who seemed to possess my heart. I took a breath and again resisted. I must bid you good night, I said, offering him my hand in parting, which he gallantly pressed to his lips. My hand seemed to burn where his lips had brushed it. My thanks for the dance, Dermot, and for showing me your hound, I said. As he rose, his blue-grey eyes met mine. It was a pleasure I hope shall be oft repeated, he said, his expression hopeful. Indeed, I answered evasively before turning away and walking back across the castle courtyard with the servant girl who had been set to watch us in pursuit. How could Dermot know? My heart was to belong to another, one who I was yet to meet, but who would break my heart into pieces should he die the death I had foreseen. I could not leave him to that fate. I mounted the spiral staircase back to my chamber to face my nightly affliction. That night I would welcome the visions, hoping perhaps to remember something useful, anything that could be the key to saving the man who already possessed my heart. Continue reading for free on Wattpad under my username LKeaneauthor.